Okay everyone, welcome back to the video lecture series for Introduction to Philosophy. In this video we're going to begin looking at the famous Platonic dialogue, the Euthyphro. And in fact, this dialogue is just going to be the first in a series of 4 dialogues that we look at in the first half of this class. Because what we're doing, now that we have a sense of what philosophy is, what we're going to be doing in the first half of this class is looking at all the dialogues associated with the trial and death of Socrates. And in this particular, so we start with the Euthyphro, and in this particular video, we're not going to get into the details of the arguments quite yet. What I want to do is say a few things about the author Plato, the character Socrates, and also give you a sense of some of the major themes that this dialogue is going to look at. So let's begin by thinking about Plato and Socrates. So this dialogue, just like the next 3 that we will look at in the first half of this course, so we're looking at Euthyphro now, then Apology, then Crito, and then Phaedo. Just like all those dialogues are written by Plato, who is an ancient Greek philosopher. But one thing you'll notice is that the main character in all those dialogues is another ancient Greek philosopher named Socrates. Now, you might ask, well, what's the relationship between these 2 individuals? Well, it's somewhat inaccurate to say that Socrates was a teacher of some sort, because he actually, as we'll see, denies that. It's often said that Socrates was Plato's teacher. Socrates was well known in the city of Athens, where they both lived. Plato associated with Socrates. And so they certainly knew each other, and Plato was inspired by and picked up many ideas from Socrates. Now, because we have this dynamic of Plato writing the dialogues and Socrates being the main character, it's natural to ask, well, whose ideas are we looking at here in this dialogue and others? Are they Plato's ideas? Are they Socrates' ideas? Is it some of both? Is it a mixture? This question won't be of huge concern to us in this class, but I will say a few things. And mostly it just depends on what dialogue you're talking about. In the first 3 dialogues we're going to look at, Euthyphro, Apology, and Crito, it's largely understood by scholars that you're looking at Socrates' ideas. Plato is using Socrates, the character, and to explain the ideas that Socrates, the actual historical person, held. Okay, that changes somewhat in the Phaedo. In the Phaedo, the last of these 4 dialogues we're going to look at, for the most part, what you're looking at there are Plato's ideas, which in somewhat important ways are different from the ideas of Socrates. Now again, this isn't a huge distinction for us. We're mostly going to be concerned with the arguments and themes in the dialogues as they stand, but just to give you a little context. Okay, now, I've explained to you that there is this progression of 4 dialogues that we're going to be looking at, and these dialogues make up a sort of story or narrative about the trial and death of Socrates. Now, one of the reasons Socrates is so famous is because, in fact, he, as we'll see, he was put to death and executed by the city of Athens. And in a certain way, at least the way he explains in the Apology, you can see his death as being a result of his absolute commitment to philosophy. So in some ways, Socrates is the perfect person for us to think about, because we've been talking about what is philosophy, why is it valuable, and he is someone who thought philosophy was so important, so valuable, that he literally was willing to stake his life on it. So that's the overall narrative structure of these 4 dialogues, and to give you a better sense of where each dialogue is set. So first, the Euthyphro, which we're reading this week, is set just prior to Socrates' trial. The Apology is an account of the speech that Socrates gives in defense of himself at trial. The Crito is an account of a conversation that occurs as Socrates is awaiting his death in jail. And the Phaedo is an account of his final hours. It gives an account of a philosophical discussion that Socrates has about the possibility of surviving our deaths. And at the very end has a scene in which he drinks the hemlock, a poison, which causes him to die. Okay, so that's the basic structure of these dialogues. But for now, we're going to be focused on the Euthyphro. Now, before we get into the text itself, I want to say a few other things just about Socrates the person. Because I think understanding Socrates as a person will give you a little more insight into some of the things he thinks and believes, which can seem a little odd from a certain perspective. So one thing that is interesting to know is he was very popular. Everyone knew who Socrates was in Athens. But he was much different than most of the people in the city who were sort of popular or well-known. Most people in Athens who were well-known were good-looking, properly proportioned. You can go and look at the sculptures in ancient Greece, the people who were idolized, and they had this sort of aesthetic appeal to them. And you look at Socrates, and he was known for being ugly. So here's this description given by philosopher Deborah Nails. Good looks and proper bearing were important to a man's political prospects. For beauty and goodness were linked in the popular imagination. So it was popular to think, well, if someone is, beautiful, they must also be good. And for, better or worse, probably for the worse, this is still an association that would exist with us today. But the extant sources agree that Socrates was, in fact, profoundly ugly. So there's a sense in which whatever way he made his way in the world, whatever success he may have had, it didn't have much to do with his bodily appearance, his aesthetics. And that's important to understanding his thought. Because in large part, one of the things that we can see with Socrates is a rejection in a very radical way of the immediate needs, desires, and wants of the body. And we can even see this in the stories that are told about the effects that certain substances had on Socrates. He was impervious to the effects of alcohol in cold weather. He could drink a large amount of alcohol without getting drunk. He could withstand very cold temperatures for long periods of time. It made him a very good soldier, which he was, but also made him an object of suspicion of his fellow soldiers. So the first thing you have to think about is here's someone who is known and popular in a way that many people aren't. He can do things that many other people can't. He seems to be a very strange figure, and that is extended when we think about the way that Socrates lived his life. So first you have to go back to the 5th century BCE in Athens and think about what was important to people then. Well, some of the things that were important then are also important now, so maybe it's not a huge difference. But as Deborah Nails describes, it was more or less taken for granted that any self-respecting Athenian male would prefer fame, wealth, honors, and political power to a life of labor. Would you rather be a simple day laborer, or would you rather be well-known, wealthy, valorized by many, and have political power in the city? And another interesting point, so it was sort of taken for granted that the life you want to live was a life of power and influence. And for that reason, it was expected that if you had any leisure time, if you weren't just a simple day laborer whose all of his time was taken up doing the sort of menial tasks or manual labor you needed to survive, you would spend that time engaged in the political affairs of the city. Athens had a burgeoning democracy, and so political power was, in a sense, available to many individuals in a way that it hadn't been previously when there wasn't a democratic society. And because this was the case, another practice became very popular, as we're going to talk about later in some lectures on sophistry. People in Athens would hire, specifically for their sons, they would hire individuals who could teach them how to gain influence with their words and rhetoric. Because if you could gain influence with your words and rhetoric, you could convince people you're correct. That gave you political power in Athens' democracy. So, what did people want in Athens? They wanted power, they wanted wealth, they wanted influence. What did Socrates want? Well, one of the things, and here Nails describes this, one of the things that seems strange about Socrates is he neither labored to earn a living, so he never worked an actual job, nor participated voluntarily in the affairs of the state. Rather, he embraced poverty, so he was very poor his entire life. The only way he could really actually subsist and live was on the goodwill of his wealthy friends like Plato. And although youths of the city kept company with him and imitated him, Socrates adamantly insisted he was not a teacher and refused all his life to take money for what he did. So he never took a cent, was impoverished all his life, and didn't do the things that you would expect him to do if he cared about political power and influence. Okay. So what exactly was he doing with his time? Socrates' life work consisted in the examination of people's lives, Nails describes, his own and others, because the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being, as he says at trial. This is a very famous statement we'll get more into. But he spent his life going around Athens in the marketplace, engaging in philosophical discussion with people in the hopes that he could get them to examine their own life, to think more critically. And in addition to that, and one of the things that makes Socrates such a frustrating figure in some sense, is that he had this reputation for irony. And what does this mean? Well, Nails explains, Socrates' irony consisted in his saying that he knew nothing of importance and wanted to listen to others, yet keeping the upper hand in every discussion. So he's always, and we're going to see this in the Euthyphro, he's always engaging in philosophical discussion with other people, forcing them to examine their beliefs, and seemingly having the upper hand. Every time he's in a philosophical discussion with someone, he seems to come out on top and embarrass the other person and make them look very bad. Yet at the same time, he insists he actually knows nothing. So, put this all together. We have someone who doesn't have the aesthetic appeal of someone who would normally be popular in the city, doesn't care about wealth or influence, goes around, perhaps irritatingly, questioning people on philosophical matters, winning those arguments, and then at the same time saying, I don't actually know anything. We're dealing with a strange figure. Okay. Now, so we want to keep that in mind as we get into the text, but one more thing before we get into the text and look at how this strange figure of Socrates interacts with his interlocutors. Why should we look at Socrates' thought? Why should we look at the dialogues that feature Socrates? One reason is because these 4 dialogues, which give an account of his trial and death, cover a wide array of different philosophical topics. So here's just a sampling of the things we're going to be talking about. They touch on questions of ethics. Socrates is very concerned with how do we live a proper human life, what sorts of things should we pursue or want to achieve, and importantly, what does it mean to care for the soul? These dialogues also touch on politics. He's very concerned with how do we properly govern the political community? When are we obligated to obey the state? And how should if ethics from a personal point of view is how do I live my best life? How do I live a proper, flourishing human life? Well, how should the state be set up to allow people to flourish? In addition, a lot of what we're going to see here has to do with how to engage in proper philosophical dialogue. One of the major underlying themes of the Euthyphro, as we're going to see, is intellectual humility. And Socrates is going to encourage those people he talks with to take a certain sort of humble attitude toward their beliefs, namely the attitude that they could be incorrect. Finally, especially in the Phaedo, but also in the Apology, we're going to look at some classical philosophical questions about identity and death. What's the relationship between the body and soul? Is it possible to survive one's own death? Is it possible for the soul to be immortal? These are all things that come up in these dialogues. So a wide range of philosophical questions. Okay, so let's dig into the text here a little bit. So the Euthyphro is named because it takes place as a discussion between this character Euthyphro and Socrates. Now, Euthyphro as the actual person is not really that important for us, so we're just going to treat him essentially as a character in the dialogue. And the important thing is, when the dialogue opens up, we see that Euthyphro and Socrates meet before each has business in court. But their business is of a different sort. So Euthyphro says that he is prosecuting someone in the court, and Socrates tells him he's being indicted. So Socrates is a defendant in the trial that will eventually lead to his death. Euthyphro is bringing charges against another citizen. Now, there's also some discussion about who exactly is accusing Socrates, and he mentions this individual named Miletus. I won't say too much about him right now, we'll get into him more when we look at Apology, but Miletus, just so you know, is one of Socrates' 3 accusers. So in the Apology we'll see that these individuals, Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon, are all bringing charges against Socrates. Now, what are the charges that Socrates is facing? Right, so before we get into Euthyphro's case, they talk a little bit about what's going on with Socrates. He mentions two specific charges. The first one is corrupting the youth. So Socrates says, what charge? A not ignoble one, I think, for it is no small thing for a young man, referring to Meletus, to have knowledge of such an important subject. He says he knows how our young men are corrupted and who corrupts them. Well, he's likely to be very wise. So the charge here is that Socrates is responsible for corrupting the youth. Along with Plato, many young men in Athens followed Socrates around. They watched him engaging in these philosophical disputes. And so the charge seems to be something of the sort that, through this association, Socrates is making the youth worse off. Now, in this statement here, now you can of course understand why that would be a concern, right? You don't want someone corrupting the youth. That's going to make the community worse off in the long run. But we should notice in this sentence Socrates' sort of sarcasm or irony. He says it's no small thing for a young man to have knowledge of this. And think about why that would be. Why would it be no small thing to know that Socrates is responsible for corrupting the youth? Well, to know that Socrates is responsible for corrupting the youth, Meletus must know what improves the youth. And to know what improves the youth, to know what improves the human person, you'd have to know, well, what is the good of a human being? How should a human life be lived? And for Socrates, there really is no bigger question than that. The question of how ought a human being live his or her life is the biggest question you can ask. So when Socrates says that Meletus is likely to be very wise, he's being sarcastic here. One of the things he is saying is Meletus is making a very big charge against him, which to substantiate, you would have to know some of the deepest philosophical questions you can ask. And in Socrates' view, he's making this very haphazardly. He's being very rash. He's not really being humble enough to admit what he may not know. So that's the first charge, the charge of corrupting the youth. The second charge is going to be very important for this dialogue specifically. Socrates says that the second charge is that of impiety. Now, what does that mean? If you think about piety or impiety, in just a very general sense, it just means if you're pious, you're following your duties to the gods. In this case, the ancient Greek context, they were polytheists, they believed in many gods, so to be pious would be to obey your duties to the gods, to be impious would be to go against your duties to the gods. And why do they say that he is impious? Well, Socrates says, Meletus claims he's a maker of gods on the grounds that he creates new ones while not believing in the old ones. So the charge seems to be that Socrates doesn't believe in the accepted gods and is creating new ones. Now we'll get more into that specific charge against Socrates later. But what's really interesting for our purposes is that the idea of piety continues to be brought up when now we look at what's going on with Euthyphro. So then Socrates says, well, what's going on with you? Who are you prosecuting? And Euthyphro says, one who I'm thought crazy to prosecute. Well, who is it? Socrates asks. Someone who will easily escape you? No, in fact, Euthyphro says, it's my father. And Socrates is absolutely shocked. He says, how could you prosecute your own father? And it's not difficult to see why. I mean, why this would be seen as a crazy thing to do. Normally we think that children should have some duty of loyalty, respect toward their parents. And it seems to prosecute your father would go against that. And specifically when we look at the charge that Euthyphro is prosecuting his father with, the charge is murder. One of the most serious charges you can bring. And again, we see some of Socrates' irony or sarcasm. He says, certainly Euthyphro, most men would not know how they could do this and be right. It is not the part of anyone to do this, but of one who is far advanced in wisdom. So he's saying, well, to know that it would be okay for you to prosecute your father in murder, you must be a very wise individual. You must really understand piety. Now, should we take Socrates seriously here? Not really. He's trying to make an underhanded point that goes right over Euthyphro's head. He's implying that, just like Meletus, you might be a little bit in over your head here. You might be a little rash. You might not have thought this all the way through. Do you really understand what the pious thing to do is? Do you understand what the right thing to do is? Are you really that wise? Or are you acting a little too quickly here? And Socrates seems to suggest that it's the latter. As we see in their dialogue, what Socrates is going to attempt to show is that Euthyphro doesn't really understand the nature of piety or what the right thing to do is in a very good way at all. So, there are really two major themes in the Euthyphro, and we've already seen one of them. And this theme is the idea of intellectual humility. And as we'll see in the dialogue, how that can be inculcated by Socratic questioning. What I mean is, we've seen that Euthyphro and Meletus both seem to lack humility about what they don't know. And as a result, in this dialogue in particular, when Socrates starts asking Euthyphro questions, we're going to just see how ignorant he actually is. We're going to see to what extent he has not thought this through. And we're going to see the same thing with Meletus when we get to Socrates' defense of himself at trial. Okay, and it's even, right, the situation, I guess, is even a little more questionable for Euthyphro when we see the exact circumstances that led to this charge. So he explains the situation. So the victim of this murder, he says, was a dependent of mine. And we were farming in Naxos. He was a servant of ours. So the person in question was a servant of their family. He killed one of our household slaves in a drunken anger. So the servant killed one of the household slaves. So my father bound him, the servant, hand and foot, threw him in a ditch, then sent a man here to inquire from the priest what should be done. During that time he gave no thought or care to the bound man as being a killer, and it was no matter if he died, which he did. So basically his father took this servant who had murdered one of the slaves, bound him up, didn't take proper care that he survived. The person went off to the priest to see what he should be done, and he died in the meantime. Now, there's a couple points to make here. First, it's not even clear that this is actually murder. Now, this is certainly a bad action. More care should have been taken, but we have a word for this. It's something like negligence. It wasn't a direct killing of this individual. And so, to that, it just was the fact that his father didn't take proper care with this person's life. Now, this is of course a bad thing, but if Euthyphro was really thinking this through, we might have said, well, is this really murder? Is that even the correct charge? And of course, as a result of this whole thing, he says, my father, obviously, and also my other relatives are very angry with me. Because he says, for they say it is impious for a son to prosecute his father for murder. But their ideas of divine attitude to piety and impiety are wrong, Socrates. So what does he say here? Well, he basically says, look, all my relatives are angry with me. They said I've done something impious, meaning they say that I've done something against the will of the gods. But you know what? They're wrong about piety. In fact, what I'm doing, prosecuting my father, is the pious and correct thing to do. Now, the point I want to make about this is, notice we have this disagreement. Euthyphro is sure that the pious thing to do is to prosecute his father. His family is sure that that thing to do is to not prosecute his father. It's actually impious to prosecute his father. And we might ask, what might this suggest about the concept of piety itself? And here's a possibility which I think really sets the stage for the dialogue. If there is this sort of disagreement about what is pious or impious, what's good or bad, then that suggests that every party to this dispute doesn't really yet understand what piety is. If we're going to know whether Euthyphro has done the right thing, we first need to know, what is pious? What is piety in itself? How do we know whether something is pious or impious? And that's exactly the sort of philosophical dialogue that Socrates and Euthyphro are going to be engaging in. Before we can know what's right to do in this specific case, we need to have a more general fundamental understanding of how we know what's pious or impious, good or bad. And in fact, we can see this dialogue is delving into the question of where does our knowledge of good and bad come from? Right, we see more of Socrates' irony here. Because remember, Socrates is also being prosecuted for impiety. So he says, "It is indeed most important, my admirable Euthyphro, that I should become your pupil as regards this indictment." What does that mean? He says, well, if you're so confident about what piety is, I need to learn from you so I can defend myself at trial against Miletus. So I can say, look, Miletus, you're saying I'm impious, but I talk to Euthyphro, the expert on piety, so I can refute your arguments. Again, we should see this as irony or sarcasm. Socrates again thinks that Euthyphro has just gotten in over his head. He's claiming to know things he doesn't really know well. Now this question of piety also brings in the second major theme of the dialogue that I want to introduce. The nature of piety, and here's the question that really gets the main chunk of the dialogue going. So tell me now, by Zeus, what you just now maintained you clearly knew. What kind of thing do you say godliness and ungodliness are? Both as regards murder and other things. Is the pious not the same and alike in every action? What Socrates is asking here is, what is piety in itself? How do we know if something is godly or ungodly? And we can put this question in more general terms. It's a question about the relationship between God and morality. Does morality depend on the existence of God? We have all these moral ideas. We think there's all these things that are moral obligations. Don't murder, don't steal, don't lie, help other people. For those things to be moral obligations, for those things to be ethical, for there to be morality or ethics at all, do we need God? And is the fact that God commands us to do something, is that enough for us to know that's the right thing to do? So one of the fundamental questions that this dialogue asks is about the relationship between God and morality. Can we have morality without God? And we will begin to get into the main arguments which touch on that question in the next video. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.